There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a country estate just before a tragedy is discovered, a stillness so profound it feels almost like complicity. On the morning of November the 12th, at Blackwood Hall, that silence was broken by the frantic ringing of a bell, but the ringing came too late. Lord Henry Rathbone, the master of the house and one of the finest amateur falconers in England, was found dead on the edge of the high moor. He had not fallen, and he had not suffered a heart attack. He had been struck on the head, and around his left wrist, bound with a brutal and unnatural tightness, were the leather jesses of his own prized peregrine falcon. The bird itself was gone. The immediate assumption, the comforting assumption, was that it was a freak accident, a bird panicked, a stumble on the rocks. But an accident does not tie a falconer's knot, and a panicked bird does not carefully place the wrong glove on a dead man's hand. Someone at the falconry weekend had gone out onto the moor with murder in their heart, and they had left their signature in the leather. Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome to Midnight Pages. We have all looked at someone and thought we knew exactly who they were, only to realize, sometimes too late, that the face they showed the world was a carefully constructed mask. If you've ever completely misjudged someone, for better or for worse, drop me a line in the comments, because today's story is entirely about the masks we wear. Settle in, pour yourself something warm, and let me take you to Blackwood Hall. Chapter 1: The Birds Come Home to the Glove. The autumn air over Blackwood Hall smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the particular sharp, metallic tang of blood on leather. It was a Friday afternoon, and the light was already beginning to fail, draining the colour from the Yorkshire moors and leaving only silhouettes behind. Arthur Pendleton stood by the Mews, watching the falconer, Callum MacLeod, feed the birds. Arthur was a young man who wore his impatience like an expensive cologne, noticeable, clinging, and generally unpleasant to those around him. He was Lord Henry's nephew, and he had come to the falconry weekend not because he had any love for the birds, but because he was the heir to Blackwood Hall, and his creditors in London were becoming increasingly vocal. "Must you let them tear at it like that?" Arthur asked, wincing slightly as a large gerfalcon ripped a strip of meat from the bone Callum held out. "It's their nature, Mr. Pendleton," Callum said. His voice was a slow, deliberate burr, the voice of a man who spent more time with animals than with people and preferred it that way. He did not look at Arthur. He kept his eyes on the bird. You don't change a bird's nature by asking it nicely. You only change it by breaking it, and a broken bird is no use to anyone. Arthur adjusted his collar. He disliked Callum. He disliked the way the falconer seemed to look through him, seeing the debts and the desperation beneath the tailored tweed. "My uncle seems to think differently. He believes he can train anything. Even a wife." Callum's hand stilled for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the hesitation to be noticeable, before he continued feeding the gerfalcon. "Lord Henry understands the birds, sir. He knows which ones to fly and which ones to keep hooded." It was a strange remark, and Arthur would remember it later, though at the time he only frowned and turned away, heading back toward the warmth of the house. Blackwood Hall was a vast, imposing structure of dark stone, built in a century when comfort was considered secondary to defense. It sat on a rise overlooking the moor, its tall windows reflecting the grey sky like blank, staring eyes. Inside, however, Lord Henry had spent the better part of a decade trying to force warmth into the place. The library, where the guests were currently gathering for tea, was a testament to this effort. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting a wavering, golden light over the leather-bound books and the heavy velvet curtains. Eleanor Rathbone, Lord Henry's second wife, sat near the fire, pouring tea from a heavy silver pot. She was a quiet, pale woman, 30 years younger than her husband, with the tense, watchful posture of a creature that expects to be struck. She wore a heavy woolen skirt and a pair of new, stiff walking boots with distinctive brass eyelets, boots that looked entirely unsuited to her delicate frame. "Henry is still out with Artemis," she said, handing a cup to Major John Clunes. The Major was a red-faced, blustering man who had served with Henry in India and considered himself the only other true falconer in the room. "Artemis is a fine bird," the Major boomed, accepting the tea. "But Henry spoils her. Flies her too loose. Mark my words, Eleanor, that bird will bolt on him one day. You have to keep a tight line on a peregrine. They're not like dogs. They don't love you." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly, and a drop of tea spilled onto the saucer. "No," she said softly. "I suppose they don't." Miss Sarah Jennings, Eleanor's companion and oldest friend, leaned forward and placed a hand over Eleanor's. Sarah was sharp-featured and observant, a woman who missed nothing and said very little. "The cold is getting to you, Ellie," she said. "You should have worn your thicker gloves today." "I couldn't find them," Eleanor said, looking down at her hands. "I had to borrow a pair from the mudroom. They were incredibly stiff. Left-handed, too." "Henry is left-handed," the Major pointed out. "Pours his port with his left, shoots with his left. Never understood how he manages the birds. Most men wear the glove on the left and manipulate the jesses with the right. Henry has to do it backward. Wears the glove on his right hand. Must be devilish awkward." "He manages," Arthur said, entering the room and helping himself to a whiskey from the sideboard, ignoring the tea entirely. "My uncle always manages to make things work the way he wants them to. Backward or forward." Just then, the heavy oak doors of the library opened, and Lord Henry Rathbone himself strode in. He was a tall man, still vigorous at 60, with a face that seemed carved from the same hard stone as the house. He wore his falconry leathers, and on his right hand, was a thick, heavily scarred leather glove. He smelled of wind and rain and the raw scent of the moor. "Artemis flew beautifully," he announced to the room, pulling the glove off with his teeth and tossing it onto a chair. "A clean stoop from 1,000 feet. Breathtaking." He went to the sideboard, picked up a decanter of brandy with his left hand, and poured himself a glass. As he drank, his eyes moved over the people in the room, his young, nervous wife, her watchful companion, his impatient heir, his old, blustering friend. He looked at them with the same calculating, predatory gaze he used on his birds, as though assessing which of them was ready to be flown, and which needed to be kept hooded in the dark. Chapter 2: The Leather and the Knot. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. The dining room was lit entirely by candles, which cast long, restless shadows across the polished mahogany table. The conversation was dominated by the Major, who recounted long, increasingly implausible stories of his days in Peshawar, while Henry listened with an expression of faint amusement and Arthur drank too much wine. Eleanor spoke barely a word, and Sarah watched Arthur with a quiet intensity that suggested they knew each other much better than their formal greetings earlier in the day had implied. After dinner, the men retired to the billiard room, and Eleanor excused herself, claiming a headache. Sarah remained in the drawing-room with a book, though she did not turn a single page for nearly an hour. It was during this hour that the first of the small wrongnesses occurred. Callum MacLeod came to the drawing-room door. He looked uncomfortable in the house, a man out of his element, turning his cap in his hands. "Begging your pardon, miss," he said to Sarah. "But is his lordship about?" "He's in the billiard-room with the Major and Mr. Pendleton," Sarah replied. "Is something the matter, Callum?" "It's his glove, miss. I was checking the tack room, making sure everything was oiled for the morning, and I can't find his lordship's glove. The one he was wearing today. It needs a rub of linseed oil, or it'll crack in this cold." Sarah frowned. He tossed it on a chair in the library when he came in from the moor. Callum nodded, though he looked troubled. "I checked the library, miss. It's not there. And there's a different glove in the tack room, a left-handed one, rubbed with neatsfoot oil, not linseed. His lordship never uses neatsfoot. Says it softens the leather too much, makes it spongy. Perhaps he put his glove away himself and you just missed it," Sarah suggested. "Perhaps, miss," Callum said. But he did not sound convinced. "I'll ask him in the morning. Good night, miss." The second wrongness occurred much later, long after the house had fallen asleep. Arthur Pendleton lay awake in his room, listening to the wind howling off the moor. He was restless, his mind turning over the mounting pile of debts in London and the cold, unyielding reality of his uncle's health. Henry Rathbone was strong as an ox. He could live another 20 years. Arthur did not have 20 years. He barely had 20 days before the creditors lost their patience. He rose, intending to go down to the library for a book to help him sleep. As he stepped into the dark corridor, he heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the direction of Eleanor's room. Arthur crept down the hallway, the thick carpet silencing his footsteps. The door to Eleanor's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the floorboards. He leaned close to the crack and looked in. Eleanor was sitting by the fire, but she was not reading, and she was not preparing for bed. She was holding a leather strap, the jess, the thin strip of leather used to tether a falcon, and she was tying knots in it. Over and over again. Her hands moved with a frantic, practiced speed, tying the complex falconer's knot, pulling it tight, then untying it and starting again. But what made Arthur's breath catch in his throat was the color of the leather. It was not the standard brown leather used for the estate's birds. It was dyed a deep, startling crimson. Arthur stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Artemis, Henry's prized peregrine, wore crimson jesses. He retreated to his room, his mind racing. Why was Eleanor practicing knots with a crimson jess in the middle of the night? And why did she look so frightened as she did it? Chapter 3: The Broken Flight. The morning of the 12th dawned grey and bitter cold. A heavy frost coated the lawns, turning the estate into a landscape of silver and iron. The falconry party gathered early in the courtyard, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Lord Henry was in high spirits. He wore his heavy tweed coat and carried his shotgun over his left arm. But he was not wearing his scarred leather glove. Instead, he wore a newer, darker glove on his right hand. "Callum tells me my old glove has vanished," Henry announced cheerfully, adjusting the strap. Mice, perhaps, or a very ambitious fox. No matter. This one will do, though it's a bit stiff. Smells of neatsfoot oil, which I detest, but needs must. Eleanor looked pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She wore her heavy boots with the brass eyelets. Sarah stood close to her, watching Arthur, who was staring fixedly at the crimson jesses hanging from the hood of Artemis, who sat perched on Henry's fist. "We'll take the high moor today," Henry said. "The wind is right. We should see some spectacular stoops." The party set off, the dogs ranging ahead, Callum trailing behind with the spare hoods and lures. The moor was vast and unforgiving, a rolling sea of heather and bracken beneath a bruised sky. They flew the birds for several hours. The Major's goshawk performed adequately, though it showed a tendency to mantle over its kill, much to the Major's loud annoyance. Arthur declined to fly a bird, preferring to walk with his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes darting between Henry and Eleanor. Around noon, Henry announced he was taking Artemis up to the crags at the far edge of the estate. "She needs the altitude," he said. "The rest of you head back to the lodge for lunch. I'll join you in an hour." "Are you sure you should go alone, Henry?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Don't fuss, Eleanor," Henry snapped. "I know this moor better than I know the back of my own hand. Take her back, Sarah. She's shivering." And so they parted ways. The party returned to the hunting lodge, a small stone building at the edge of the woods, where a hot luncheon had been prepared. They waited an hour. They waited 2. By 3 o'clock, the light was beginning to fade, and the wind had picked up, howling through the chimney of the lodge. "He should be back by now," the Major said, pacing before the fire. "It's getting too dark to fly a bird safely." Callum appeared in the doorway of the lodge. He looked pale, and his hands, usually so steady, were shaking. "I went looking for him," Callum said, his voice barely a whisper. "Up by the crags." "And?" Arthur demanded, stepping forward. "He's dead, sir. Lord Henry is dead." The party rushed to the crags, stumbling over the uneven ground in the fading light. They found him at the base of a steep, rocky incline. He lay on his back, his eyes open to the grey sky. There was a terrible wound on the side of his head, a crushing blow that had cracked the skull. Blood matted his silver hair and pooled on the frozen heather beneath him. But it was not the head wound that made the Major gasp, or caused Eleanor to turn away and bury her face in Sarah's shoulder. It was his left hand. His left wrist was bound tight, incredibly tight, by a pair of crimson leather jesses. The leather had bitten deep into the skin, tied with a perfect, complex falconer's knot. The bird, Artemis, was nowhere to be seen. And on his left hand, the wrong hand, he wore a thick, scarred leather glove. The missing glove. The glove that Callum had been looking for the night before. The Major knelt beside the body, his face ashen. "Good God," he whispered. The bird must have panicked. Tangled the jesses around his wrist. He slipped, hit his head. "Birds don't tie knots, Major," Arthur said, his voice cold and flat. He was staring at the crimson leather, remembering the rhythmic tapping in the night, the sight of Eleanor's frantic, practicing hands. And a panicked bird doesn't put a glove on a man's hand. Callum stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the glove. "That's his lordship's old glove," he said softly. "The one that went missing. But he always wore it on his right hand. He was left-handed." Arthur looked at the body. The right hand was bare, the skin pale and exposed to the cold. The new, stiff glove that Henry had been wearing that morning was gone. "Someone," Arthur said slowly, looking around at the pale faces of the falconry party, "someone changed the glove after he was dead. And someone tied those jesses." The silence on the moor was absolute, unbroken even by the wind. It was the silence of a truth that no one wanted to speak, but everyone could see. Lord Henry Rathbone had not fallen. He had been murdered. And the killer was standing right there with them. Chapter 4: The Uninvited Guest. The police arrived from the nearby village of Blackwood St. Jude just as the last of the light died. Inspector Thomas Rudge was a meticulous man, solid and unimaginative, who liked his facts neatly arranged in rows, like cabbages in a kitchen garden. He did not like grand country houses, he did not like aristocrats, and he particularly did not like murders that looked like freak accidents but clearly were not. He spent the evening interviewing the household, methodically recording alibis that were entirely useless, as everyone had been together at the lodge, or so they claimed, during the hours Lord Henry was alone on the moor. Arthur had stepped out to smoke. The Major had gone to the stables to check on his goshawk. Eleanor had retired to the lodge's small bedroom with a migraine. Sarah had gone for a walk to clear her head. Anyone could have slipped away, hurried up to the crags, struck the blow, and returned before they were missed. It was just after 10 o'clock the following morning, while Inspector Rudge was examining the crimson jesses in the library, that the front doorbell rang. The butler, a solemn man named Hastings, opened the door to reveal an elderly lady standing on the top step. She wore a sensible tweed coat, a hat that had been fashionable perhaps 20 years ago, and she carried a large, rather worn knitting bag. She looked exactly like someone's grandmother arriving for a long-dreaded weekend visit. "Good morning," the lady said, her voice mild and fluffy, like spun sugar. "I am Miss Jane Marple. I believe I am expected." Hastings blinked, a rare crack in his professional facade. "Expected, madam?" "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, looking mildly flustered. "Have I got the day wrong? Sarah, Miss Jennings, wrote to me last week. I am her great-aunt, you see, on her mother's side. She suggested I come up for the weekend. The country air," she said, "would do my bronchitis a world of good." Sarah appeared in the hallway, looking astonished, which quickly shifted into a look of profound relief. "Aunt Jane! I didn't think you would actually come." "Well, my dear, when I received your letter, I thought, why not? But Hastings here looks quite shocked. Have I arrived at an inconvenient time?" Sarah stepped forward and took the old lady's arm. "Aunt Jane, something terrible has happened. Lord Henry, he died yesterday." "Oh, my word," Miss Marple said, her blue eyes widening in distress. "A heart attack? How dreadful for his poor wife." "He was murdered, madam," Inspector Rudge said, stepping out of the library. He looked at Miss Marple with the weary resignation of a man who has enough complications to deal with and does not need an elderly relative added to the mix. "I am Inspector Rudge. And I'm afraid this house is now a crime scene." "Murdered?" Miss Marple pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh, how truly awful. I must leave at once, of course. I shall just go down to the village inn." "Nonsense," Sarah said firmly. "You can't stay at the inn. You must stay here. It will be a comfort to have family around." Inspector Rudge looked as though he wanted to object, but he had no legal grounds to evict a guest, and Miss Marple seemed so entirely harmless, so delightfully bewildered by the whole affair, that he simply sighed and returned to his notes. Miss Marple was shown to a comfortable room on the second floor. She unpacked her small suitcase, took out her knitting, and sat by the window, looking out over the grey expanse of the moor. She had not, of course, come for the country air. Sarah's letter, received 3 days ago, had not mentioned bronchitis. It had said, "Aunt Jane, I am very frightened. The atmosphere in this house is toxic. Arthur is desperate, Henry is cruel, and Eleanor is unraveling. I found Eleanor practicing knots in the middle of the night, and she looked terrified. Please come. Miss Marple began to knit a pale pink baby bootie, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. She had arrived late, after the tragedy had already unfolded, but she did not mind. Sometimes, it is easier to see the shape of a shattered vase after the pieces are scattered on the floor, rather than when it is whole and perfect on the shelf. She went down to luncheon, sitting quietly at the edge of the conversation, her fluffy white hair and vague smile rendering her almost invisible to the strained, fearful people around the table. She listened. She observed. She noticed the way Arthur Pendleton's eyes kept darting to the heavy sideboard, where the brandy decanter stood. She noticed that Major Clune spoke too loudly, filling the silence to avoid thinking about what had happened. She noticed that Eleanor Rathbone ate nothing, simply pushing a piece of cold chicken around her plate, and that she had changed her boots. She was wearing soft indoor slippers, though everyone else wore sturdy shoes against the drafts of the old house. But most of all, she noticed the falconer, Callum MacLeod, who stood by the door waiting for instructions. She noticed the way he looked at Eleanor. It was not the look of a servant to a mistress. It was the look of a man who is watching something fragile balance on the edge of a great height, waiting for the moment it falls. "Inspector Rudge seems very thorough," Miss Marple remarked mildly, offering a small, inconsequential smile to the table at large. "He was examining some red leather straps in the library when I arrived. Jesses, I believe Sarah called them." Arthur's head snapped up. "Crimson jesses. They belong to Artemis. My uncle's bird." "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, dropping a stitch and retrieving it with practiced ease. "And they were tied around his wrist? I know very little about falconry, but surely one does not tie a bird to oneself quite so permanently. What if the bird wishes to fly away?" "You don't," Major Clune said gruffly. "You hold the jesses in your hand, or you loop them over your fingers. You don't tie them to your wrist. It's madness. If a heavy bird panics, it could drag you, or break a finger. The knot was deliberate. Someone tied it to make sure the bird couldn't escape." "But the bird did escape," Miss Marple pointed out softly. "The leather snapped," Arthur said. "The police found the broken ends. The bird panicked when he was hit, struggled, and broke the leather." "I see," Miss Marple said. She looked at Eleanor. "My dear, you look quite exhausted. Sarah mentioned you had a migraine yesterday afternoon. Did you manage to sleep at all while the others were out on the moor? Eleanor's pale face flushed slightly. Yes. I slept in the lodge. Sarah was with me part of the time. Sarah confirmed, her voice steady. Eleanor didn't leave the lodge. How fortunate, Miss Marple said, smiling vaguely. A migraine is a terrible thing. I suffer from them myself. One becomes quite oblivious to everything else. You wouldn't have heard a thing if anyone had left the lodge, I imagine. The silence in the dining room became thick and uncomfortable. Miss Marple went back to her knitting, having cast her first stone into the pond, waiting to see which way the ripples would run. Chapter 5: The Tack Room. Inspector Rudge was not a stupid man, but he suffered from the common affliction of believing that the most obvious answer is usually the correct one. The most obvious answer in this case was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had the motive, debts that threatened to ruin him, and an inheritance that would save him. He had the opportunity, he had left the lodge to smoke, and no one could verify how long he had been gone. By the following afternoon, Rudge had practically built a fortress of suspicion around the young man. Miss Marple, meanwhile, preferred to look where no one else was looking. After luncheon, while Rudge was relentlessly questioning Arthur in the library, she took a gentle stroll toward the stables, her knitting bag hooked over her arm. The air was bitterly cold, the sky heavy with the threat of snow. She found Callum MacLeod in the tack room, cleaning a set of leather hoods with a rag that smelled strongly of saddle soap and oil. The tack room was a small, functional space, lined with pegs holding leathers, jesses, swivels, and bells. A small wood stove burned in the corner, keeping the air dry and warm to protect the equipment. "Good afternoon, Mr. MacLeod," Miss Marple said, hovering in the doorway like a moth. "I do hope I'm not intruding. Sarah told me this is where the Falcon's equipment is kept, and I confess I find it all quite fascinating. Such intricate little things." Callum paused his polishing, looking at her with a wary, measured gaze. He was used to the gentry ignoring him or ordering him about. He was not used to elderly women taking an interest in his work. "You're not intruding, Miss Marple," he said slowly. "But there's not much to see. Just leather and brass." "Oh, I think there is always a great deal to see, if one knows how to look," she said, stepping inside. Her eyes flicked over the neat rows of gloves hanging on the wall. "For instance, I understand there was some confusion about Lord Henry's glove. The one he was wearing when it happened." Callum's expression tightened. "Yes, he wore his old glove, the one he favored, on the moor that morning. But the glove on his hand when we found him was a new one. A stiff one. The one I'd set out as a spare because I couldn't find his old one. And the old one hasn't turned up." "How very peculiar," Miss Marple said, touching the edge of a thick, padded gauntlet. "Why do you suppose someone would switch a dead man's gloves?" Callum looked down at his rag. "I couldn't say, And the knot," she continued, her voice as soft and innocuous as wool. "The knot tying those crimson jesses to his wrist. Inspector Rudge seems to think the bird tangled itself. But you don't think so, do you?" Callum looked up, his dark eyes fierce. "A bird doesn't tie a knot like that. It was a one-handed falconer's knot, tied tight and secured. Someone tied Artemis to his wrist. Deliberately. To make sure she couldn't fly away after he fell. No, Callum said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. To make sure she'd panic. A peregrine tied tight like that, with a man thrashing or falling, she'd bait. She'd beat her wings and fight the tether. The leather broke, eventually. But before it did, the bird would have caused absolute chaos. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Lord Henry was left-handed, you said. Did he tie his knots differently because of it? Callum hesitated. He tied them backward. The loop goes the other way around the swivel. It's a small thing, but if you know what to look for, you can tell. And the knot on his wrist? It was tied standard. Right hand. Miss Marple smiled, a small, sad smile. Thank you, Mr. MacLeod. You have been most helpful. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Oh, one more thing. Eleanor, Lady Rathbone, she wears such sturdy boots for walking. Brass eyelets, I noticed. Very distinctive. Were they a gift from her husband? Callum's jaw clenched. No. Lord Henry bought them for her, yes. But they weren't a gift. They were a requirement. He said she was too soft for the moor. He wanted to toughen her up. I see, Miss Marple said quietly. Men who try to toughen women up often fail to realize how strong they make them in the process. Chapter 6, The Footprint in the Frost. The weather broke that evening. A fierce squall blew in off the moor, rattling the windows of Blackwood Hall and plunging the house into a draughty, uneasy gloom. Dinner was a miserable affair, interrupted halfway through by Inspector Rudge, who marched into the dining room looking triumphant. He carried a plaster cast in his hand, a crude but unmistakable impression of a shoe print. I apologize for the intrusion, Rudge said, though he did not look sorry in the least. But my men and I have been examining the ground near the crags before the snow ruins it. We found this. He set the plaster cast on the table, right next to the silver soup tureen. Arthur Pendleton stared at it, his face draining of color. It's a very distinctive tread, Rudge continued, his eyes fixed on Arthur. A bespoke London shoemaker, I'd wager. Not the sort of boot you'd normally wear on the moor, Mr. Pendleton, but you weren't planning on hiking, were you? You just needed to slip out of the lodge, find your uncle, strike him with a rock, and get back before anyone noticed. I didn't, Arthur stammered, standing up so quickly his chair tipped backward with a clatter. I never went near the crags. I was smoking behind the lodge. The footprint was found less than 10 yards from the body, in a patch of soft mud that froze overnight, Rudge said flatly. You owed a great deal of money, Mr. Pendleton. Your uncle refused to pay your debts. You knew you would inherit the estate upon his death. The motive is clear. The opportunity is established. And now, the physical evidence. It's a lie! Arthur shouted, looking wildly around the room. Someone must have stolen my shoes. Sarah, tell him. Tell him I was at the lodge. Sarah Jennings sat perfectly still, her face a pale mask in the candlelight. I didn't see you, Arthur, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You said you were going out to smoke. I didn't see you come back. Arthur stared at her, betrayed, terrified. Rudge signalled to the constable standing in the doorway. "Arthur Pendleton, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Lord Henry Rathbone." "You are not obliged to say anything." The rest of the words were drowned out by the howling of the wind outside. Arthur was led away, protesting his innocence in a voice that cracked with panic. The dining room descended into a heavy, suffocated silence. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, trembling. Major Clunes poured himself a large glass of wine and drank it in one gulp. Miss Marple quietly buttered a piece of bread. "How very efficient of the inspector," she murmured. "To find a footprint in the mud just before it snows. A bespoke London shoe, too. Quite unmistakable." "Arthur is a fool," the Major said harshly. "Always was." "But murder?" "I didn't think he had the stomach for it." "Perhaps he didn't," Miss Marple said softly, though no one seemed to hear her over the wind. Chapter 7: The Open Window. With Arthur Pendleton removed to the village lockup, the atmosphere in the house should have lightened. The murderer was caught. The threat was gone. But instead, the tension in Blackwood Hall only thickened, like milk turning sour in a thunderstorm. Miss Marple did not believe Arthur Pendleton was guilty. He was desperate, yes, and selfish, certainly, but he was not meticulous. The murder of Lord Henry Rathbone had required careful planning, a deep understanding of falconry knots, and the cold-blooded nerve to tie a panicked bird to a dead man's wrist. Arthur Pendleton panicked when he had a bad hand at cards. He would never have had the composure to execute such a complex deception. The real danger, Miss Marple knew, was that the killer now felt safe. And a killer who feels safe often makes mistakes. Or, more dangerously, tries to tie up loose ends. That night, Miss Marple awoke to a sound. It was faint, muffled by the wind, but her hearing was excellent. It came from the floor above, where Eleanor Rathbone's bedroom was located. It sounded like a heavy thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple did not hesitate. She slipped out of bed, wrapped a thick woolen shawl over her dressing gown, and stepped into the dark corridor. She climbed the stairs quietly, her soft slippers making no sound on the carpet. The door to Eleanor's room was closed, but a sliver of light showed underneath. Miss Marple knocked softly. "Eleanor, my dear? Is everything all right?" There was a long silence. Then, the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door opened a fraction, and Eleanor's face appeared in the gap. She looked terrified, her eyes wide, her hair disheveled. "Miss Marple," she whispered. "May I come in?" Eleanor hesitated, then opened the door wider. The room was freezing. The heavy sash window, which looked out over the moor, was thrown wide open, the icy wind billowing the curtains into the room like ghosts. "My dear girl, you'll catch your death," Miss Marple said, moving quickly to push the heavy window down and latch it. Why on earth was the window open? Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't open it. I was asleep. I woke up because the room was so cold. I got out of bed to close it, and I tripped." She pointed to a heavy brass candlestick lying on the rug. It was on the window-sill. I think someone was in here." Miss Marple looked at the window-sill. It was clean, save for a small, dark smudge near the latch. She leaned closer. It smelled faintly of neatsfoot oil and old leather. "Did you hear anything?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Just the wind," Eleanor said, shivering violently. "But I felt someone." "Miss Marple, they were looking for something." "Looking for what, Eleanor?" Eleanor shook her head, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." Miss Marple sat beside the younger woman and took her icy hands. "You do know something, my dear. You have known something since the moment you came back from the moor. And you are frightened because you realize that Arthur's arrest hasn't stopped the nightmare. In fact, it has only made it worse. Because the real killer is still in this house." Eleanor sobbed, a ragged, desperate sound. "They'll think I did it. The police. Arthur saw me. He told me he saw me the night before Henry died." "So you doing what?" "Practicing the knot," Eleanor whispered. "The falconer's knot. I was using a spare Jess. A crimson one." Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with quiet, devastating precision. "And why were you practicing that knot, Eleanor?" Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with a terror that was entirely genuine. "Because Henry told me to. He said if I couldn't learn to tie a bird properly by the morning, he would make sure I regretted it. He made me practice for hours." Chapter 8: The Shape of the Truth. The next morning, the snow stopped, leaving the estate blanketed in a heavy, blinding white. The police had withdrawn, satisfied with their catch, leaving the inhabitants of Blackwood Hall isolated in a silence that felt heavier than the snow. Miss Marple found Sarah Jennings in the library, staring into the fire. Sarah looked older than her 30 years, her sharp features drawn tight with anxiety. "Good morning, Sarah," Miss Marple said, taking her usual chair and pulling out her knitting. "There is nothing good about it, Aunt Jane," Sarah said bitterly. "Arthur is in a cell, and Eleanor is terrified of her own shadow." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "A very difficult situation. But a clarifying one, I think." Sarah looked at her sharply. "Clarifying?" "Well, it clarifies who the killer is not," Miss Marple said, examining a dropped stitch. "Arthur did not kill his uncle. The footprint was a very clumsy plant. Someone took one of Arthur's bespoke shoes from his room, walked it into the mud near the crags, and put it back. A clever idea, but rather ruined by the fact that the mud was soft when the print was made, but frozen hard when Lord Henry died. The footprint was made the night before the murder." Sarah blinked, her composure faltering for the first time. "The night before?" "Yes. And Eleanor did not kill her husband either, despite the fact that someone went to great lengths to make her look guilty. Making her practice the knots with a crimson Jess, so she would be seen doing it. Leaving the window open in her room last night to frighten her, to make her look hysterical or guilty. If Arthur didn't do it, and Eleanor didn't do it, Sarah said slowly, then who did? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked a question that seemed entirely unrelated. "Sarah, my dear, when Eleanor came in from the moor on Friday afternoon, complaining of the cold, she mentioned her gloves were stiff. Left-handed gloves, she said. Do you remember?" "Yes," Sarah said cautiously. From the mudroom. Exactly. And Lord Henry's glove, the one he was wearing when he died, was also a left-handed glove, and it was also stiff, smelling of neatsfoot oil. It was the wrong glove for a left-handed man who wore his glove on his right hand. Sarah frowned. I don't understand. It is really quite simple, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Lord Henry did not die wearing that glove. The killer wore that glove. The killer used it to handle the bird, Artemis, after striking the blow that killed Henry. The killer tied the jesses to Henry's wrist to make it look like an accident. But in the panic of the moment, the killer made a mistake. They took off their own glove and put it on Henry's hand, thinking it was his. But they put it on his left hand, because the killer is right hand, and instinctively put the glove where they would wear it. But why would they do that? Because, Miss Marple said softly, they had to take Henry's real glove away with them. Henry's real glove had something on it that would have proved it was murder. Something the killer couldn't afford for the police to find. Sarah was silent for a long time. The fire crackled in the grate, a loud sound in the still room. And what was on the glove, Aunt Jane? Sarah asked finally, her voice perfectly level, all the anxiety gone, replaced by a cold, hard calm. Miss Marple stopped knitting. She looked up and met Sarah's eyes. Blood, my dear, Miss Marple said. Not Lord Henry's blood. The killer's blood. Because Lord Henry fought back, didn't he? He struck out before he fell. And he caught the killer on the arm, tearing the sleeve, perhaps, and bleeding onto the heavy leather of his own glove. Sarah did not move. She did not speak. But the silence in the library was no longer the silence of shock or grief. It was the silence of a trap springing shut. Chapter 9, The Hidden Wound. Sarah Jennings did not scream, nor did she attempt to run. She simply sat back in her chair, the mask of the concerned companion slipping away completely, leaving behind a face that was terrifying in its absolute composure. You have a very active imagination, Aunt Jane, she said, her tone suddenly clipped and patronizing. A killer's blood on a missing glove? It's the plot of a penny dreadful. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking again. But real life is often much more melodramatic than fiction, I find. People do terrible things for love, and even more terrible things for money. You did it for both, didn't you, Sarah? You loved Arthur. But Arthur is a weak man, a man drowning in debt. He needed this estate to survive, and he needed it quickly. So you decided to expedite matters. Arthur is a fool, Sarah said softly. But he is my fool. He would have ruined himself waiting for Henry to die of old age. And Henry? Henry was a monster. You didn't know him, Aunt Jane. He broke things. He broke birds, and he broke Eleanor. He enjoyed it. And so you decided to break him first, Miss Marple said gently. You took a heavy walking stick, or perhaps a rock from the crags. You followed him out onto the moor on Friday afternoon. You knew exactly where he would be. And you wore the stiff, left-handed glove from the mudroom, the one Eleanor had complained about, so that you could handle Artemis after the deed was done. Sarah's eyes narrowed, glittering in the firelight. And how do you propose I managed all this without being missed? You said you went for a walk to clear your head, Miss Marple reminded her. No one saw you at the lodge during that crucial hour. Eleanor was asleep. Arthur was hiding his nerves behind the building. The Major was at the stables. You had ample time to climb to the crags, strike the blow, and arrange the scene. Arrange the scene, Sarah repeated, a mocking edge to her voice. By tying a falcon to a dead man's wrist. Yes, Miss Marple said. It was a very clever idea, really. A freak accident. A bird tangles its jesses, the falconer trips and falls. It might have worked if you hadn't made a mistake with the knots. You are right-hand, Sarah. You tied the knot the standard way. But Lord Henry was left-handed and tied his knots backward. A small detail, but the devil is always in the details. Sarah laughed, a dry, humorless sound. A knot? That is your proof? That I tied a knot backward? A competent barrister would destroy you in court, Aunt Jane. Oh, the knot is not the proof, Miss Marple said cheerfully. The knot merely told me what happened. The proof, my dear, is the glove. Sarah went perfectly still. The glove is missing. Callum said so himself. Yes, Miss Marple said. It was missing from the Tack room. Because you took it. When Henry struck you on the arm before he fell, he tore your sleeve and left your blood on his glove. You couldn't leave it there, so you took his glove and left your stiff mudroom glove on his hand instead. And you couldn't throw Henry's bloody glove away on the moor, because the police would search the area. You had to bring it back to the house. You intended to burn it, I imagine. In the fireplace in your room. Sarah's right hand twitched, moving instinctively toward her left arm, which was concealed beneath the heavy wool of her cardigan. You haven't been able to use your left arm properly since Friday, Miss Marple noted softly. You pour tea with your right hand. You hold books awkwardly. And last night, when you went to Eleanor's room to leave the window open and frighten her, a cruel trick, Sarah, intended to make her look unstable and direct suspicion away from Arthur, you dropped the candlestick because your left arm is injured. You have no proof, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling now with an anger she could no longer control. I asked Callum to check the ashes in your fireplace this morning, while you were at breakfast, Miss Marple said, dropping a stitch and ignoring it entirely. He found the metal rivets of a falconer's glove. Leather burns, my dear, but brass does not. And the police, I am sure, will be very interested to examine the wound on your arm. Chapter 10: The Flight of the Falcon. The library door opened, and Inspector Rudge stepped inside. He did not look triumphant anymore. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been marching confidently in the wrong direction for 3 days. Behind him stood Callum MacLeod, his face grim, holding a small cloth bag containing the charred brass rivets retrieved from the ashes of Sarah's fireplace. Miss Jennings, Inspector Rudge said heavily, I must ask you to roll up your left sleeve. Sarah did not move. She looked from Rudge to Callum, and finally, to Miss Marple, who was rolling up her knitting with a sigh of profound sadness. You always were a meddling old woman, Sarah said, the venom in her voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. You couldn't just leave it alone. Arthur would have been free. Eleanor would have been free of that tyrant. I did them a favor. You killed a man in cold blood, Inspector Rudge said, stepping forward. And you let an innocent man sit in a cell for it. Arthur is weak, Sarah spat, finally standing up, her composure entirely shattered. He would have lost the estate in a year without me. I did it for him. I planned everything. I planted the footprint. I made Eleanor practice the knot so she would look guilty if the police looked too closely at her. I thought of everything. Everything, Miss Marple said quietly, except the simple fact that a left-handed man does not wear his glove on his left hand. Sarah glared at her, her breathing ragged and harsh. Then, with a sudden, desperate movement, she pushed past Inspector Rudge and bolted for the door. She made it as far as the grand hallway before the constables, stationed outside, intercepted her. She fought them with the frantic, terrified strength of a trapped bird, baiting against her captors, her cries echoing off the high stone walls of Blackwood Hall. But it was useless. The Jesses were tied. Miss Marple remained in the library, listening to the commotion fade as Sarah was taken out into the cold. She felt no triumph, only a deep, abiding sorrow for the waste of it all. So much cleverness, so much passion, twisted into something dark and destructive. Callum MacLeod lingered in the doorway. He looked at Miss Marple, a quiet respect in his dark eyes. "You knew," he said softly. "You knew it wasn't the young master. Arthur Pendleton is a fool, Mr. MacLeod, but he is not a murderer," Miss Marple said, picking up her knitting bag. "He lacks the necessary imagination." "And the bird?" Callum asked. "Artemis. Do you think she'll come back?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the snow lay thick and heavy over the moor. "A peregrine is a wild thing, Mr. MacLeod. When the tether breaks, it rarely returns to the glove that held it. It finds its own way." Chapter 11, The Empty Mews. The aftermath of a murder is rarely neat. It is a slow, painful process of untangling lives that have been knotted too tightly together. Arthur Pendleton was released from the village lockup late that afternoon. He returned to Blackwood Hall looking entirely different. The arrogant, impatient air had been replaced by a pale, shivering man who seemed to have realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, the true cost of his own weakness. He did not ask to see Sarah. He packed his bags and left for London the following morning, leaving the estate in the hands of the solicitors. Eleanor Rathbone remained. With Henry gone and Sarah's toxic influence removed, she seemed to breathe easier, though the shadows under her eyes would take time to fade. She walked the halls of the great house not as a frightened captive, but as a woman slowly learning to claim the space she occupied. Miss Marple stayed for 3 more days, ostensibly to recover from the shock, but largely to ensure that Eleanor was not left entirely alone in the sudden silence of the estate. On her final afternoon, Miss Marple walked down to the Mews. The snow was beginning to melt, the steady drip of water the only sound in the courtyard. Callum was there, cleaning the blocks and perches. The Mews felt emptier without Henry's booming voice, but it also felt peaceful. "You're leaving us, Miss Marple?" Callum asked, setting down his brush. "Tomorrow morning," she replied, smiling warmly at him. "My own garden in St. Mary Mead will be needing attention soon. And I think Blackwood Hall has had quite enough of my meddling." "You saved an innocent man's life," Callum said seriously. "And you gave Lady Eleanor a chance to actually live hers. We owe you a great deal." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple said, fluttering a hand. "I simply noticed a few things. People are very much the same wherever you go, Mr. MacLeod. A village, a country estate, the patterns of human behavior do not change." She looked at the empty perch where Artemis had Saturday. "Have you seen any sign of her?" Callum smiled, a slow, genuine smile. "I went out on the high moor this morning, before the sun came up. I saw a peregrine circling the crags. She was flying high and fast, riding the thermals." "Artemis?" "She wasn't wearing jesses," Callum said. "But she looked free. I think she'll do fine on her own." Chapter 12: A Quiet Departure. Miss Marple departed Blackwood Hall on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Lord Henry Rathbone had been found dead on the moor. The sky had cleared to a brilliant, fragile blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and impending spring. Eleanor walked her to the waiting car, looking almost radiant in the sharp sunlight. She wore a soft woolen coat, and on her feet were a pair of comfortable, sensible shoes, the heavy boots with the brass eyelets having been quietly discarded. "Thank you, Aunt Jane," Eleanor said, embracing the older woman. "For everything." "Take care of yourself, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her shoulder. "And take care of this house. It needs some warmth." "I will," Eleanor promised. "Callum is staying on to manage the birds. I think we will do very well." Miss Marple settled into the back seat of the car, her knitting bag resting comfortably on her lap. As the car pulled away, crunching over the gravel drive, she looked back at Blackwood Hall. It was still a vast, imposing structure of dark stone, but the windows no longer looked like blank, staring eyes. They caught the morning light, gleaming with a quiet, steady promise. And high above the moor, a single dark shape circled against the blue sky, wild and unburdened, riding the wind. Well, my friends, that brings us to the end of our time at Blackwood Hall. A reminder that the things we build to trap others often end up being the very things that trap us. The Falconer's knot is designed to hold tight, but as Miss Marple showed us, even the tightest knot can be undone if you know exactly which thread to pull. I hope you enjoyed this visit to Midnight Pages. If the cold of the moor is still in your bones, pour another cup of tea, throw another log on the fire, and let the quiet settle in. I'm Jack. Stay warm, stay curious, and I will see you right back here, in the reading nook, for the next story. Good night.